They're all dead or lost in that town now anyway. Bastian sputters, doesn't really even respond, and just runs off towards Stone Ridge. And we've got Kynan standing there like... and he just follows. Hey, how are ya? I'm Anderson, and welcome to the chapter finale of Kill 10 Rats Plays Ironsworn. I mean, it's Ironsworn, so I hope this is the chapter finale, but all the signs point towards having reached the climax of this first story arc that was, in my head, initially supposed to last about one episode. The situation at hand is straightforward and at the same time fairly complicated. We have unleashed, somewhat involuntarily, an ancient horror upon the world, and the world in this sense right now means the village of Stone Ridge that is in grave danger. So we're gonna have to find a way to save it, and Kynan at this stage where we rejoin him is pretty much on his own again. If we remind ourselves of the initial journey here up the fjord, past where we first encountered Trim, to the village of Stone Ridge, from that entrance to the delve site, there's still a good couple of hours to go until we reach the village. So maybe an hour, 2, 3, somewhere, depending on how quickly we walk. In this case, not very quickly, because Kynan is pretty beat up. He's in horrible physical and slightly less horrible mental shape. The only thing he still has going for him in some ways is the momentum and the fact that Etana, the ancient white protector of this site, is also out and about and trying to bring this horror down again. And let's not forget Trim and his connection to the Primordial of the Strait that will potentially intervene somehow. There's a lot of things for us to work out as Kynan trudges along the coastline. And I think the first thing we can work out is the reason that he's alone right now, feeling somewhat alone, because Saskia and Bastian just walk significantly faster. So while they move at a relatively normal pace, Kynan is unable to keep up right away, falls behind, and won't see them again until he arrives with a severe delay also at the village of Stone Ridge. So in sequence of who arrives in Stone Ridge at what order is the Shona / the horror first, Etana maybe about like half an hour later, Saskia and Bastian not having inhuman endurance and constitution of a white maybe like another half an hour later, and then Kynan perhaps another half an hour later. I think that's roughly the staggered delay that we're talking about here. So that gives Shona / the horror about a half hour to work with in the village to invoke whatever its true abilities are now that the survival has been ensured and that escape has been accomplished. And to my mind, that first thing on the list next would be to satisfy the hunger. But I don't think we care about that right now. What we care about more is to roll it up from Kynan's perspective, as first it's likely that he still runs into Saskia and Bastian, depending on what they decided to do, depending on what happened in the village. So I'd like to ask an oracle there to extrapolate from whether we can treat what Bastian and Saskia are doing as of its own thing, or whether we have to weave it into the grander context of what Etana and Shona horror are doing. 26 for the action, that gives us withdraw, okay. And we are going for 83 on the theme, which is religion. I don't really have anything for this that would work for me. Let me just flip the results into what was it, 62 and 38 to see what that gives us. Maybe that's better in terms of inspiration. Overwhelm. And protection, overwhelm protection. That gives me an idea, actually. Kind of let's say it's an idea that is somewhat consistent with a question I had in mind over the last couple of days in how to read Saskia and the obligation or whatever it is that she now feels towards Bastion for stepping to her side and getting her out of the line of fire from Shona. And overwhelm protection actually gives me kind of a mental image that works for me, I think. That scene that I'm kind of working towards also gives me an idea on whether or not we have a scene that is decoupled from what Itana and Shona have been doing, and I think that is now pretty much its own thing. So the first thing that Kynan will walk into is the connection between the overwhelm protection Saskia Bastion dynamic. Kynan is in a tough spot. It's been several hours since he saw the receding forms of Saskia and Bastion disappearing in the distance, in the darkness of the deepening night. Not long after they disappeared from view, the weather got decidedly worse. The wind picking up, the sea lapping at the shore, coming closer, almost putting that little path between the cliff face and the deepening water underwater. And on top of all of that external misery, Kynan also has some time to think and go through events in his head. I think mercifully, to some extent, Siora is gonna leave him alone on this walk. She realizes that he has the resolve now to do what she considers the right thing, and probably doesn't want to pile on. But Kynan's definitely got some food for thought on this walk. He has his resolve still to not run from this, to perhaps in some way also pay whatever price that fate exerts from him for his survival here, for consolidating his position before he pursues his own revenge. And I think his thought bounds from what would have happened if he hadn't attacked those two salvagers those few nights ago when they came upon him in the early morning, rather, all the way to could he have been quicker on Shona's grab for the relic. And maybe we can actually leverage this internal monologue, dialogue with himself into an opportunity to, well, it's almost like understand on, are we moving towards or are we moving away from the breaking point? I'd like to roll, let's call it like an unprompted endure stress, just to give us an idea in which direction Kynan's head's moving. Okay, that's a pretty remarkable result considering the circumstances. So he is quite resolute, really, if we think about all the external factors, and I think we can reflect that reflection in deducting one momentum down to 5 and giving us an additional spirit to +2, just as a kind of representation of this recharging while he moves a bit slower and lumbering. He uses that time, that mental time, to steel his willingness to really do something that has been severely out of character for him for the last at least decade or so. So as he comes upon the village still during the receding now night, he doesn't immediately make out what's going on because we haven't really figured that out yet. I think it's safe to say we hear some sounds, some activity, some screams. It is a horror out there after all. The flickering of fire from inside the village core, so not in that external horseshoe-shaped elevated walkway where Bastion has his house, but towards the burned down ruin of the village hall. That seems to be where the action is. And initially Kynan walks up the planks of the walkway and raises himself up above the sea level towards the houses, very eerily isolated and alone. There's no one watching, no one guarding. Everything seems to be dead silent except for the commotion from the village center. And so he walks slowly, sword out, just from house to house, keeping an eye on the spaces between the houses, pushing forward towards where Bastion's cabin, his house is, and probably, well, is he gonna check in there or will he just push past it? I think it's likely that he's about to push past when the door gets pulled inward and like an arm shoots out and grabs him and so pulls him inside. And in the split second between him wanting to bring up his sword and stab in the direction of his unknown assailant and the little bit of illumination from the inside revealing the features of his quote-unquote attacker, he realizes that it's Saskia pulling him inside, and he stumbles a few steps forward and the door closes behind him again. Now what's the scene? What is overwhelmed protection here? I think what we're dealing with here is Saskia's way of meeting her responsibility and repaying like for like in her own way. So what Kynan sees is Bastion's mostly empty and somewhat disheveled living quarters with a few items of furniture knocked over, a single candle illuminating a little semicircle of space. And outside of Saskia, who is now backing away a few steps, we also have Bastion there, at least from his overall clothing and just the general stature. Kynan can't infer that this is Bastion. He can't really see his face because he's got a sack over it, and he's tied to a chair, and he doesn't seem to be particularly conscious. So we have Kynan looking at Bastion, looking at Saskia for a long moment and just going, what the fuck? When he found his home empty and seemingly ransacked, he made to rush towards the village core. I didn't think that was very prudent, so I made sure he stays safe. Kynan again finds himself in a position where this seems logical to him, even though it's not particularly nice. But it works, so Bastion is still somewhat under. He's not completely gone, but like the head is moving sometimes, and there's a groan coming, and probably also a few specks of blood from whatever scalp wound that Saskia inflicted, making sure that he goes and doesn't do anything overwhelmingly suicidal. So Kynan, now seeing Bastion safe, will ask Saskia what else is the situation here. Does she know anything? That's mighty kind of you. Where did Etana go? What an excellent question. Let's ask the Oracle where Etana went and what she did, because we also don't really know whether she's currently part of that screaming and fiery business in the center of the village, or whether she's doing something else. 35. Falter. What is going on? 13 time. Falter time. My main thing I can think of is that with Trim and the Atanya still also having plans that will affect what's going on here, and Saskia, Etana and Trim being connected via the Primordial, my assumption would be that Etana is now doing almost the same thing that Trim was doing, and knowing that reinforcements are coming, awaiting her opportunity. So faltering time in the sense of I will halt my advance and let time pass to have our second stage of cavalry arrive. So instead of answering directly, Saskia pulls the door open and gestures for Kynan to take a gander into the darkness, and now that he is a bit closer and not as wired on his immediate surroundings, he sees that lone silhouette outlined against the darkness, brought into shape somewhat by the light coming down from the top of the village, and it's just Etana standing in a white stance, back turned to the sea on the ramp up to where the village center is, and holding her shield and sword pointed to the ground, and just standing there unnaturally still, waiting. And what about Shona? What about Shona? 85 construct. 44 faction. Alright, construct faction. So Saskia describes to Kynan what happened in the time in between her making sure Bastion stays put and her realizing Etana wasn't going anywhere and coming back to keep an eye on Bastion. She crept towards where Etana is and took a gander of what's going on in the upper reaches of the village, where Shona came into view a couple of times and obviously also knew that Etana was there. There was even a little scene where she was standing as the horror on top of that descending walkway towards the sea, where Etana's standing at the foot of it looking up, and them just acknowledging each other and nobody making a move towards the other. So what Saskia describes is that there are villagers and raiders together dragging other villagers out of their houses, and the whole like corralled hostage situation has fallen apart, as part of the hostages are now part of the ones that are rounding up the other villagers and just fell on each other to the point where it settled into a more of an orderly thing after a couple of spontaneous murders and lynchings where villagers strung other villagers up. And they've now reached this strange equilibrium where Saskia would see the occasional couple of raider villager terrorizers dragging some person into a house and screams coming out of there. And what I could imagine also what she would witness, seeing that ruin of the formerly great hall with its remaining posts standing there charred by the fire. You have a few villagers and raiders that are infected by Shona staging in front of the coral, now huddling other side, the terrorized, staging like mock executions to just generate fear, keeping people, like leading them up to where a crossbeam is between two burned down pillars and just dropping them off of a rope before letting them struggle a bit before they just like take them down again, and doing it the same thing with some other person, and every once in a while just letting someone hang and die. To my mind, this is all the feeding and propagation aspect of the horror. So the horror works in a way where we have this ability to speak, but it's not necessarily important what the horror says. So if we wind back to the point where Shona first enters the village again, walks up to the remains of her raiding party to where the villagers are corralled off, and just starts talking in that horror voice, and it'll have one of two possible effects depending on probably personality and your innate fight or flight reflex, which between villagers and raiders all of a sudden there's no difference anymore, and they'll hear what makes sense to them to act out what the horror wants them to do. So the raiders will have seen Shona come up and hear the horrors whisper, but what they hear in their heads, the ones that are more on the side of acting out against fear, they will hear how the grave has already been plundered by the villagers and they're hiding the treasure somewhere, and we have to round them up and scare them into revealing, and there is the village leader, she will have to know, and then inflicting all sorts of horrors on the village leader first, and probably also stringing her up, and then it just snowballing from there, and some villagers joining over and in their twisted minds, in their infected minds, just rationalizing it as what we were rich all this time, how dare they not tell us about this, and where's this treasure that they're talking about. And there you have these two factions forming, one the ones that are the sustenance, and the other ones that are more the extension of the horror's will, really, the corrupted now. That's what we already saw in foreshadowing unintentionally from in the Delph side with these walled in corpses where the former old warders had interred the ones that were part of the horror's consciousness now. And so Saskia gives Kynan a bit of a breakdown of what she saw going on there and all of this whole madness that's erupting now in Stoneridge, and that after taking perhaps a longer look at Bastion, also shaking her head and going like, I'm not sure that he's going to like what he finds when he wakes up, regardless of how this develops. So we've got Kynan now giving her a long measured look, nodding, saying, I'm sure they'll understand that it was all for a good cause. And with those words he throws the treasure of the grave of Itana, that gold platinum engraved chain, on the table between Saskia and Kynan, and where the three of them are located, and just gives Saskia a look. Vow fulfilled. Ooh. So let's fulfill our vow, because that's where we're at, really. We got 8 progress. We got the treasure. Let's scale back a second and say we have 8 progress, because I decided in between sessions that I want to mark progress here for now bringing the treasure to Saskia, because that's what we've done. We've got it here. There she is. Here's your treasure. So last progress made. Let's fulfill the vow now. Let's see how it goes. Okay. What the hell? Interesting. Matching fulfillment. Well, strong hit means on a dangerous vow we get 2 experience points, so I'll mark those quickly, and then I want to kind of figure out what what the benefit is that now Saskia... It is once again Oracle time. 91, escalate. Does not sound good. Let's remind ourselves that this is a positive thing, hopefully, that an interesting thing that happens. 04, ally. Escalate ally. I have an idea for it, but we'd have to survive for that first. So let me make a note of escalate ally, and maybe we can bring that back later. But for now we'll just have Saskia snort a laugh and look at the chain, not really picking it up, just bemusedly almost. And I kind of need to figure out the dynamic here is who is in the lead at the moment, because we have a strange relationship between those people. Bastion's still out. He's not contributing much, but between Saskia and Kynan, whose lead are we following here? Is Kynan waiting for Saskia to say something? Is Kynan gonna... Saskia doesn't really strike me as the one that will look to Kynan to figure out what to do next, so she's gonna do regardless. I think it's more like Kynan to check in with her now as to what now. And with the read that we have on Saskia right now, and Shona as well, and I think Saskia understanding the situation Shona is in, that Shona isn't really there, or maybe even is no longer in existence, depending on what the horror does to people, she will seek some form of closure, because she's not without bonds, she's not without loyalty to the people that she lets close, which is probably a circle of 1, and that's Shona. So her take on this is to now pick up the piece of jewelry that has been briefly described to her by Kynan in the sea cave as to what its purpose and function was in regards to Itana. And she says, "Seems to me we need to put this necklace to its original purpose, don't you think?" So she's in. She's on board. Team, put the necklace back on the horror, bring it back down to rest, to imprisonment somehow. So they're, I think, without much further ado, they're about to rejoin Itana. And as Saskia is already stepping out the door, Kynan takes a few steps over to Bastion, takes that bag off his head and cuts through the ropes that are tying him to the chair. He's still out, but more in a sense of, well, when he comes to, hopefully already something has manifested and he can do his thing. So Saskia and Kynan rejoin Etana, still motionless, still standing there waiting, and they cast a glance up in the village again, seeing more of that more orderly commotion there right now, where I'm almost imagining it as like sort of the center mass of the villagers and the possessed being in that mock execution loop in the old burned down Great Hall that you could see from down below, and occasionally branching off pairs or triplets of these possessed leading off individual villagers to houses and doing gods know what to them. So, what next? We should probably, at this point, ask the Oracle what the Primordial and Trim are up to, because I don't think Etana will move before that has been resolved. 11 break. 64 structure. Break structure? Well, let's give a thought to this in light of primordials as they're described here. So, personification of the natural world, control the elements, destroy with primal rage. So, we've established that the primordial is somehow the resident owner of the waterways in this strait. A consciousness that is almost like a similar vestige that the horror is, but on the flip side. So it's not exactly nice. And that was almost a worry of mine that I think I already gave voice to in the previous episode. The primordial wants the horror to be brought to heel again. It doesn't necessarily care at all that there is a village of Stonebridge. It doesn't have a concept really of that. It thinks in different terms, if thinking can even be acquainted to what it does. So it has its set of tools set up now, which is Trim and the Atanya that have their boats there. It has the village there receding from the water, which is its natural element. We've got the Atanya in place to raid, presumably, and lend some military assistance. So if I'm the primordial essence, I'm thinking very laterally and practically. There is the horror. Here is my guys down here on the water. Let me bring them closer. So about the same time that Saskia and Kynan rejoin Etana, the weather takes a turn for the even worse. The rain comes down in almost in solid strings of water. The lightning strikes, just the thunder booming in the darkness, the lightning illuminating the scene more so than the fire does. Smaller fires in the village are almost being put out now, and underneath all that cacophony is a low rumble coming up from behind. And as Kynan and Saskia turn to look, they have just about enough time to react and brace themselves for impact, because what they see is a wall of water coming towards them, about the height of where the upper village is, completely towering over the buildings on stilts, the lower part, and with the last conscious thought before the water crashes over them, Kynan finds himself thinking, are those ships up there? Because the Atanya are being carried into the village. It's like the walls of the fjord are now almost like the banks of a river, as water just crashes through them in an absurd display of chaotic primordial power, and it just breaks these wooden buildings like matchstick constructions, because they don't matter. Not to the will of the sea. I think that warrants a face danger for Kynan just to see how he fares in this and whether this just puts him under and knocks him unconscious, or whether he somehow manages to roll with it and just not get completely wiped out by this Ironlander tsunami. 4, 3, a 6. I'm thinking we're doing this with edge, I think. So that's a strong hit. Getting 1 momentum out of this, which leads me to believe Kynan is lifted off his feet with a piece of the walkway he's standing on that he manages to grab and hold on to, and just gets turned to the side and almost like torpedo-like shot up through the mass of water. Beat up, of course, but he almost doesn't feel it. He's black and blue all over already, and just gets carried with the overwhelming force up into the center of the village, as it gets catapulted out of the water and comes crashing to a halt with the keel of an Atanya ship embedding itself in the ground next to him, almost crashing into the remains of the village hall. And now what happens to the others? I think with the purpose of this whole attack to break structure and bring in the troops being to get rid of the horror, we should probably determine what happens to the pairing of Etana and Shona now. I would imagine that Etana just got pushed towards Shona by the Primordial in there. I'm assuming that's where the actual Primordial as a personage was, so kind of like a sweeping Etana up in the Primordial's arms and just carrying her up to where Shona is before releasing her and receding the water back to the sea. So we have like Shona seeing that mass of water, the horror seeing that mass of water coming towards it, with Etana kind of cradled on the crest of these waves and just being dropped sword and shield first into battle. And now I want to establish the situation that Kynan finds when he pushes himself up to his feet with Atanya coming down, rushing into the village and engaging everything that is resisting, or what's left of the village really. So action theme once again. 0-2 clash. 30 bond. Clash bond. What image does that give me? I mean, we've got 2 bond options really. Either we read it in terms of the Ironsworn rules, which means like a personal connection, which between Etana and Shona, the horror, it exists, but I don't really see how that would translate into a scene right now very well. But there's also the bond concept as just being bound to one another, and I think that gives me an idea on how to read this one. Kynan, after being catapulted out of the wall of water, clinging onto his salvation, this piece of wood once again, like it seems like he's getting thrown about by this Primordial every other week now, pushes himself up, gets his bearings. The Atanya still, I think, just aware that this is one of the guys that came out of the cave, so we've got bigger fish to fry. These enormous, stocky, giant bodies just running in all directions from Kynan's position, and immediately becoming engaged with the horror's extension of will as groups of raiders and villagers fall on the Atanya. And at the far end of the burned down village hall, behind where the action is currently starting to unfold, Kynan gets an image of 2 figures locked into each other in a way that is patently not humanly possible, because a human would be dead. He sees Shona's body and Etana, each with their weapon in hand. Etana's sword extended through Shona's torso, impaling her in place, while Shona's axe is buried in the side of Etana's head, and she holds on to her at the same time around her throat, and they're just at a stalemate right now. They are locked in a clash, bound with each other in an impossible balance that now I think needs an intervention before the horror breaks free. I think we need to reach Shona so we can attack before Shona breaks free. And if that sounds like a scene challenge to you, well, you will be entirely correct. Calling this a dangerous one because I don't think there is as many waypoints to reach. It's more Kynan having to make his way through a mess of unfolding battle between the horror guiding and controlling its extended corrupted minions, the Atanya making a huge mess of them, and Kynan just wanting to get towards Etana and Shona to ideally intervene with his sword before Shona can either pop Etana's head off, or we don't know. It kind of depends on how we roll as well. What happens? Like if we roll if we fail this somehow and roll a negative match or something, I think Etana is probably toast. But let's see when we get there. So first off, we have Kynan just bobbing and weaving through clashing bodies, and just also not just the bodies, but the receding water coming down, and the pieces of debris, and probably also some bodies being swept down again now that the Primordial's initial onslaught recedes again back into the sea. I don't even want to have Kynan turn around now to see what's happening behind, because I don't think there's much left. So he, with use of dexterity, he tries to make it closer. That seems to work. So we do have progress here. We're calling this dangerous. That gives us 2 progress and no progress on the countdown. And before we take a further step, let's maybe also figure out what happened to Saskia. 45 seas, 41 burden, seas burden. 50-50 chance, is Bastion the burden? 51 plus he is. 58, okay. Kind of a neat wrap up there. So Saskia is off to a side, having been flung into the wall of a house that somehow withstood, like one of the buildings that were about as far as the water reached, and as fate would have it, in the debris that got swept up, rained down on the upper level of the village, spotted the unconscious form of Bastion, who now is in decidedly worse shape than before, and definitely not awake, and just pulls him free of him being like half crushed by pieces of detritus. So that tells me Saskia is momentarily distracted, busy, will likely not keep herself busy too long, so I'm imagining that she will also somehow find her way to an engagement with Shona, depending on how this plays out. But let's continue. That's a weak hit, so we lose a countdown, we make a progress, and we have to pay a price, I do believe. What's our complication here? I think we have, like, we're rushing through. Oh, that could be interesting. As Kynan bobs and weaves through the battle unfolding, skirts one Atanya bulldozing past him and slightly adjusts, almost slipping on a piece of just raw mud that is now, and a patch of raw mud that is now, well, because the whole place got flooded. So he briefly takes his eyes off course, and as he rights himself and pushes forward, he runs into Pierce's fist that flies in his direction and just knocks him on the chin. He rolls with a punch, so he doesn't take... Well, actually he does. He rolls with the punch, but he has to endure harm because we have to pay a price. So we're paying in form of health, even though we don't have it, as Pierce, who is among the corrupted, is looking for some payback, because I like little bits of resolution and callbacks to previous episodes. So endure harm. Ooh boy, consider yourself endured, which means we get another moment. No, we can't. Now we can't at 0, right? We can't spend momentum anymore to regain health. Is that how it worked? Yes. So we take 1 momentum, which is nice. And we... Well, there is definitely still a... Pierce has the element of surprise. Pierce is under the horror's control, but he's attacking with his fist, kind of as a sword. I think we're gonna secure an advantage with iron to reflect our level of superiority here, and depending on how that goes, Pierce is no longer in this fight. Oh, okay. Secure an advantage, strong hit, very much so. Yeah, okay, so we can roll with the outcome of the move. I think I want to take the 2 momentum here because we are going to need it, and that puts us in, well, to reflect this, I'm almost having this like Indiana Jones moment where, just because of the fact that Pierce is a overweight unarmed villager and Kynan is a non-heroic but still very capable fighter with a sword, this is almost a bit of a, you know, Pierce now bobbing and weaving and Kynan just ramming the sword into his gut, dropping him and proceeding to rush onward. Bye, Pierce. We're facing danger. It's another weak hit. Gives us another 2 progress and another progress on the countdown, which the bound figures become a bit more active as they're almost like slowly rotating around each other and trying to like the one trying to just dig that sword in deeper, the other one trying to rip the throat out at the same time, trying to like digging that axe even deeper into the skull. What price do we pay? I think it's a matter of you win some, you lose some. We gain 2 momentum, we lose 1 because we slip and slide and go down, and kind of now covered in mud has to get up again and sees that time is getting short. The gauntlet is closing in front of him as more and more of these possessed come out of the houses and get in between Shona and the onrushing Atanya. Another face danger. Ooh, okay. Kynan lunges forward, just makes the most of his dexterity and circumvents a few of the villagers that are also perhaps more visually more zoned in on these onrushing half giants of the sea that are now forsaking their beached boats behind up in the village and coming and wanting to do some business with the horror as well. So Kynan is close enough to where I think I can now try and resolve the scene challenge and reach Shona to, well, see what we can do about this. Because I'm not sure he's just gonna jump in there and lob her head off. It's not I mean, she's still in there, I think, going by what Atana experienced. So how do you get that result? Well, we'll see. Let's resolve the scene challenge first. Make a progress roll versus 8 progress. Double 5s. You are absolutely joking. Okay, that helps, I guess. Well, first off, we achieve our goal unconditionally, which means we reach Shona before she breaks free. Now, what added bonus gives us hand up for resolving whatever comes next. Let's ask the Oracle again. Summon? 87 strength, 8. Summon strength? Whose strength? This is a bit of an either or scenario. Is it Shona or is it Etana? It's probably not Kynan. I think summon strength, this is more also like an exterior factor for me, this happenstance now. Let's give it a 51 and above is Shona, 50 below is Etana. 92. But it's a good thing that happens to us, a positive twist. So Shona summons her strength, not the horrors. So the scene I'm picturing is Kynan barging forward, leaving the last of the obstacles in his wake, and jumping in to also plunge his sword into Shona's upper body. I think he's not gonna, come rushing in there and behead her. He doesn't really have a plan at this point. He just knows that somehow Kynan has some previous experience with horrific creatures and possessions and things like that. So what he knows likely is that the host is only on the seesaw on the upswing if the horror is under pressure and distracted or otherwise engaged. And in this case, for Kynan's measure, the host is almost always doomed. It's just a question of on what terms do you perish. And one of the things that Kynan, I think, understands on some level is that the more you attack the host body, the more the horror is occupied trying to hold it together, the more the host has a chance of momentarily summoning their strength. So as Kynan's sword arm is about to come down, he sees a change coming over the facial expression and the eyes of Shona / the horror, and he pulls back and he sees like the head dropping and looking at the sword sticking through her chest and at the mask of the white impassively standing there. Lets go of the axe, which kind of wavers in Etana's skull, but then drops to the floor. And with Shona impaled momentarily back in possession of her faculties, Kynan draws closer and he hears her whisper with like bubbles of bright blood coming out of the corners of her mouth. I have brought dishonor on myself. So how does this continue now? How do we capitalize on this? Saskia is probably approaching now. What's Etana doing with this momentary shift in host horror constellation? Let's give it an oracle prompt. 42 demand. 14 duty. Demand duty. Oh, I think I like where this is going. We have Shona momentarily in control of her faculties. We have Etana seeking redemption, and her redemption being fulfilling the imprisonment of the horror, but the horror is currently in Shona, who has brought dishonor on herself, and Etana knows a way to restore honor to yourself if you mess up and mess around with horrors, and that is to take on that duty. Kynan is still standing there trying to work out what to do now, and sort of hesitantly standing there with his sword out but not attacking anymore, and Etana and Shona locking eyes. Etana was like voicing some words in her old worlder language intended for Shona, who more than understanding them picks up on their meaning through the connection that they have as both like former or current vessels of the horror. And there is a relief coming over Shona's expression as she just, in this almost dying voice, whispers, "I vow it." And in this moment, Saskia arrives, and Kynan already understands somewhat where this is going, looks at Saskia, and Shona also turns her head, and Saskia, for the first time, looking distraught, seeing that, and leans in close. Something passes between the two that Kynan doesn't hear, and after a brief exchange between the two, whispered exchange between the two, because Shona cannot rally more than just effectively being held up right now by the sword sticking through her, cannot rally more than a whisper. You have Saskia stepping back, looking Shona in the eyes one presumably last time, and putting that necklace, that wrought golden engraved treasure of the grave of Etana around Shona's neck, closing it. And with that, the light just goes out of Shona's eyes, and Etana takes a step back, pulls the sword out. Shona collapses. The battle's still ongoing, because once you've been corrupted, touched by the horror, you're not gonna just snap out of it, but the central authority is gone. So we have more pockets of resistance now being crushed by the Atanya. Saskia is standing over Shona's outstretched form, just mutely looking down at her and looking around her, not really here entirely with the past that they shared and the part that Saskia had in all of this. And I think here and now, just to reflect the outcome of this, Etana lays down her sword next to Shona, lays down her shield, takes off her mask, showing a withered, dried out, mummified, skeletal skull face, lies the mask down, takes a few steps back and just turns towards the clouds, towards the horizon. And I'd like to think there is a small moment where the clouds just part and the first rays of dawn break through on Etana, who just sinks to her knees and crumbles. Vow fulfilled. Redemption achieved. I didn't see that coming. I actually needed a short break and a coffee after this. This is I thought we'd have a boss battle here and be like righteously screwed as Kynan, because every time we get bopped in the head, losing health, we're on the brink of death already. But I mean, I like this outcome. And I was zooming into the grand scheme of things. Let's take stock. I don't think we need to determine the outcome of the battle. We have 4 long ships of Atanya being deployed in the center of the action. We have the houses below, like 3/4 of the village just wiped out. We have the Atanya beating down all remaining resistance of the horror touched, and Saskia and Kynan sort of mutely standing unaffected by all of the chaos around them for a couple of minutes, just looking down at the peaceful outstretched form of Shona, whose wounds already stopped bleeding because she's dead. but she's also now a white. And Saskia bending down, taking that mask and fastening it to Shona to cover her face. And as they stand and look down, they see almost like a quicksilver reflection along the mask as it reforms itself to resemble a little caricature of Shona's features. And we've got a delegation of Atanya walking up, led by Trim, who just gravely takes it all in, takes in the remains of Etana, looks at Shona, understands, of course, what happened, just acknowledges the next redemption seeker, and doesn't really even give the time of day to Kynan and Saskia as the Atanya move forward to pick up Shona's body reverentially between four of them, with Saskia tempted to intervene but then letting it go, and the Atanya just walking slowly back down into the lower part of what used to be Stone Ridge, led by Trim, bringing Shona back to the grave of Shona now, I think. As for Bastion, he is not paying anything any mind. He's just digging through rubble, running around, shaking survivors, trying to find his family, as Saskia and Kynan realize this is probably it. Like, there's no point to any of this anymore. For Kynan, it's time to get out of here, because there is no real here anymore, and he needs to follow his revenge path. Saskia's band is gone, and she's doubtful that she's very welcome in this village once things have settled down. So maybe we can escalate ally now and form a bond. Kynan, you're making some strange friends. If you make this move after you successfully fulfill your vow, to their benefit you may re-roll any dice. Roll plus heart. Let's see how this one goes. That's a weak hit so far. Let's re-roll the 9. Now it's a strong hit in a match. So Kynan, where are your bonds? Where is Hulata, who we've probably already forgotten about? There we are. Saskia. Bond. Now, what is our narrative complication here that works to our advantage? Let's ask the Oracle. 38. Share. 28. Decay. Share decay. I mean, I like the idea of sharing, but I'm not necessarily all in favor of sharing decay. So what is the inverse result? Enemy. Share enemy. Now, wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? Escalate allies, share enemy. You know what I'm thinking is that for now, I think she shares an enemy with Kynan, but she doesn't know that yet. Neither does Kynan. That probably was a long one, but I'm gonna leave this in one piece because it is our finale here for what I consider the first story arc of this campaign. Yeah, very gratified by how this went overall. Couldn't have pictured any of this happening in advance necessarily, because this is just wildly off of anything to do with our main quest, but I like the narrative parallels that kind of, you know, with the horror and the Siora and the character growth and kind of a little bit. There is a, well, it's been long enough. I think I'm gonna make a separate video kind of stock taking of chapter 1. So lest I ramble more, thank you very much for watching. catch you then, and bye for now.